Hello, AGR 2470. This is Professor Naselski coming to you from my house. I wish I was in person and we were in class together. It was canceled, obviously, today. And hopefully, we'll be in person for the rest of our classes together. I just figured it was better for me to stay home rather than walking around class, talking and babbling, and potentially getting a bunch of people sick. So, without further ado, let's start. The next four lectures are going to be about cropping systems. I'll define what that is in a moment, but first I want to give an appreciation for cropping systems because in this lecture I'll give you an introduction, but also an appreciation. So let's start. Okay, so again, everything I tell you, I like to back up with data, and this is a chart. On the x-axis here, we have the year, so we have year, 1 AD. All the way here, we have 2017. This data goes up to 2020. And then on the y-axis, we have basically human population, global population, and 2, 4, 6, 8, 10 billion people. The main thing to notice is that in 1920, the human population was 1.8 billion. And before 1920, you saw a slow and very steady rise in population growth, but very slow, emphasis on slow. But between 1920 and 2020, right, just a blink in the eye, like 100 years, a blink in the eye in terms of our human history, human population essentially quadrupled from 1.8 to 7.8 billion people. And the question is, how? Right? How did this happen? It's great that we quadrupled. I mean, it's great that I'm alive. I'm happy to be alive. I'm happy that I have friends and there's lots of people around and they're happy to be alive. And so we're all happy to be alive. There's way more of us around. And how? How did this happen? Right? This quadrupling of the human population. The way I'm going to tell you about the way we appreciate cropping systems is to understand that before 1920, the advent of modern agriculture, we'll talk about what I mean by that. Before the advent of modern agriculture, people were hungry most of the time, right? Now we talk about being hangry when we don't eat, like when we miss lunch, when we don't eat for 6 or 7 hours. But for most of human history, going hungry for 6 or 7 hours was a regular, everyday, average occurrence. So you can see here in 1947 and 1948, so right after World War II, there was actually a ration book. This is in the United Kingdom. There was a Ministry of Food. So you couldn't just buy as much butter or as much ice cream or as much bread as you wanted. It was rationed because there just wasn't enough or there was enough for everyone, but just enough. They didn't want people just buying up a bunch of bread. In 1928, Herbert Hoover, his slogan, he was a presidential candidate in the United States, and his slogan was a chicken in every pot. So that is a button that you see, a button for his presidential campaign. It would be really strange for someone in 2024 or 2023 to be campaigning, hey, we're going to have everyone can eat chicken in every pot, right? There's enough chicken. There's enough chicken that people don't necessarily, most people, aside from people who are very disadvantaged, but the majority of Canadians, they can eat chicken when they want. So, from my perspective and the perspective I want to impress upon you, cropping systems have been incredibly successful since the advent of modern agriculture, right? They're feeding people. Now, how did this happen? Obviously, farmers are at the center of this story. Farmers are the people who grow the food. But it is the marriage or the linkage of farmers with scientists, and that doesn't just mean academics and universities, but scientists in private sector as well, industry working for themselves, and government regulations, right? People that set regulations, regulate the marketplace, set up regulations that set the rules for the game, so to speak, in terms of the marketplace, the agricultural commodity marketplace. It's that marriage that has supercharged agricultural productivity, cropping system productivity since 1920. So here are three real quick examples here. Here we have, on the left here is Fritz Haber. He won the Nobel Prize for chemistry. And on the right, you have a very young Albert Einstein. This is Albert before he became famous. This is when he was actually a patent clerk. So he would read over patents that scientists submitted for patenting inventions. What Fritz Haber did was he invented a very cheap way to to fix nitrogen. Okay, before there was no real nitrogen fertilizers around. You had to use manure, or you had to buy guano, basically fossilized bird poop. You had to import that from Chile or Argentina and use that guano. But with the advent of the Haber-Bosch process of nitrogen fertilization, we have a tremendous explosion in the availability of nitrogen fertilizer, cheap nitrogen fertilizer, and that really helped boost crop yields, especially cereal crop yields, nitrogen fertilizer. Here we have John Deere. John Deere was a blacksmith in the Midwest of the United States, and the soils in the Midwest, very high in organic matter. They tend to stay wet for very long. They have a really high water holding capacity. So when farmers would do tillage, the plows they would use, the moldboard plows that they would bring in from the UK or from further on the East Coast, they would basically the mud would stick to those plows, and so a plow, that implement, would not be able to do a good job of flipping over the soil because there was just so much mud stuck to that plow. John Deere, this blacksmith, invented what's called a self-scouring plow, self-cleaning plow, so the mud would not stick to that moldboard plow as it went through the soil. Okay, then you have Gladys West, who, not many people were responsible for inventing GPS, or global positioning system. So it's not just one person, but Gladys West had one of the largest roles. She was a scientist for the U.S. Air Force. So her work was basically like top secret until declassified, in the last 15, 20 years. But what she helped do is map out or develop this concept for a global positioning system. Because, of course, GPS was used by the military before it had civilian uses. So Gladys West, a PhD, not a lot of people know about her. Her work was top secret for a long time. But she helped develop GPS as we know it today. And GPS is used in lots of agricultural applications on combines and on tractors to allow a farmer to basically map spatially their yield or map spatially their fertilizer rate across a field. They know where they are, and auto steer, so farmers are very rarely, hand driving their tractors anymore. They can set a straight AB line and just let the tractor drive itself. So GPS, hugely important for cropping system productivity. And lots of different people, scientists, farmers, inventors, etc., responsible. And so you guys are entering the industry, and you're part of this story. Okay, so cropping systems. We tend to focus, what you'll focus on in your courses at university, we tend to focus on the problems with agriculture, right? How fertilizer use is causing nitrous oxide emissions, is causing greenhouse gas emissions, how animal agriculture is causing greenhouse gas, how we're losing farmland, or how tillage is destroying the soil, and we're getting erosion and the soil is being destroyed. There's lots of problems. I'm not here to say that those problems are not real or they're not real problems. They are real problems. But again, my perspective that I'm impressing on you is that these are actually consequences of success, consequences of the massive and spectacular success we've had with cropping systems. These problems are amazing problems to have compared to someone, 200 years ago who's subsisting on potatoes, and they don't have a diverse diet, and they don't have as much to eat as they'd like. So we'll talk about these more in detail, but these are consequences of successes, the problems associated with agriculture. All right, so how did cropping systems succeed? We talked a little about the social science or the human side, where we have farmers who are willing to innovate, adopt innovations, change their practices, because that's no guarantee. We have scientists and inventors, business people, academics, inventing and collaborating to do innovation, make innovations. And we have governments providing ground rules to level the playing field. So how did cropping systems succeed? I'm going to go over a couple of case studies to show how cropping systems succeeded. Now we're coming out of the pandemic. And so normally in class, I would normally stop and ask you guys, hey, we just came out of a pandemic. How do you feel the food system performed? How do you feel the food system performed? And so I have some photos of, empty shelves, during the pandemic. These are meat ration cards that Canada distributed during the Second World War. Again, to buy meat during the Second World War in Canada, you had a certain allotment, X kilograms per person per week, and you could not exceed that. So I'll leave that for now, but we would normally have a discussion. Okay, so takeaway, what do I want you to know for the quizzes and the final exam? Just understand what is the motivating question for the next lectures, and what is the recent development responsible for removing constraint on human population growth. It's this tremendous increase in agricultural productivity, cropping system productivity, allowed by, again, farmers at the center. We have scientists and innovation, and then a level playing field brought on by government regulation. Okay. Cropping systems definition. So what is a cropping system? So it is the crops, their sequence, and their management, and adapted to a given environment. So I'll explain what each of these words mean, but we essentially break this down to what we call the G by E by M framework. That is the framework we're using, the G by E by M, to analyze cropping systems. Again, we're analyzing what crops, their sequence, their management, and how they're adapted to a given environment. Okay, so G, the G part of this G by E by M framework that we're using has to do with genotype. Genotype is the species of crops, corn, soy, wheat, rice, cassava, whatever, and then the variety. So if you're going to grow a variety of cassava or a variety of rice, generally you are planting a specific variety. You're not just, picking a cassava at random and saying, this is what I'm going to grow, or a corn plant at random, this is what I'm going to grow. You're buying, normally you're buying or you're saving seed, if in that case, specific cultivars, specific hybrids or varieties to plant. And specific varieties are adapted to specific environments. We cannot, say in Ontario, use corn hybrids or soybean varieties that are planted in Georgia or planted in Mexico. Okay, those hybrids and cultivars are adapted to a completely different environment, different photo period, different growing, frost-free period, etc. Then we have environment. So that has to do with the climate we are in. Okay, not the weather. Weather shifts from year to year, right? We have dry years, wet years. That changes from year to year, but the climate. Okay, climate, which is the long-term average, right? How much rainfall do we expect on average, etc. And then finally, the other aspect of the environment for cropping systems is the soil, right? What is the soil texture? What is its soil fertility? How much nutrients can it provide? What's its organic matter or water holding capacity? How deep is that soil? What's its depth to base layer, right? Is it a very thin soil profile or is it very deep? So lots of different soil properties influence what can be grown, what the cropping system is. Finally, M, and that encompasses all the management decisions that are made by farmers. And so some students at this point ask, with M, if a farmer is making a decision about what variety to grow, right? What variety they should grow, is the variety selection management or is it genotype? In reality, right, it is both, but for the purpose of this class, it's going to be variety. And I say that because when we use our G by E by M framework, we can assume that farmers are already growing for a given variety, or a given crop species, rather, the best variety possible. So our assumption is that in terms of when we're analyzing our cropping system, they are growing the best, most adapted variety for their environment already. So that is a G component, not an M component, even though it is a farmers in reality have to decide, hey, what cultivar will I grow? Now, the most important part of the G by E by M framework has to do with this X, the interaction between these three factors, G by E by M. As we're going to see with some real-world data, with some case studies, you can't analyze a cropping system just by looking at the change in G or just by looking at the change in E. Or I guess you could, but the major yield increases that are responsible for the quadrupling of the human population aren't due to a single factor change. It's due to the interaction, multiplicative effect of changing, say, E and M or G and E and M together. Okay, so going back to that definition of cropping systems, when I say the sequence of crops grown on a field, I basically mean crop rotation. Now, crop rotation is just that. It's on a given field, what crop is planted after the other, after the other, after the other. In temperate field crop production, so in Ontario, where we really only have a 6-month window for growing a crop, we generally grow annual crops. These are things that are planted and harvested within a year. And we can generally only grow one annual crop per year, right? There's only enough time in the growing season to grow one corn crop a year, or one soybean crop a year, one canola crop a year on a given field. In warmer areas, for example, in Missouri, and further south in the southern United States and into Argentina, it's common to grow two crops a year. You can grow corn and soybeans in the same year. You can grow winter wheat and soybeans in the same year, etc. In Ontario, that doesn't really happen. So when we think about crop rotations in Canada, we're talking about one crop a year. Some really common ones in eastern Canada that bear special mention are continuous corn. That's not really a rotation. We call that a monoculture, where you're just growing the same crop year after year after year. You're not rotating a crop. Another more common or as common crop rotation would be corn, soy, where you're rotating corn one year and soybean the next year continuously. So corn, soy, and then corn and soy. And you can have many other derivations depending on the farmer, what they prefer, how they prefer to manage and market their crops. So, for example, you can have one year soybean, another year spring wheat, another year canola, another year oats. That would be a 4-crop rotation going back into soybean after oats. So, crop rotation, really important concept for cropping systems. Okay, so these are the takeaways for this cropping systems definition. What are the three components? And just understand how the most important aspect of our framework for analyzing cropping systems, G, E, and M, is the interaction between those two. And we're going to run through some case studies in a moment.